we believe?
Yes.
Do we believe the word?
Yes.
Do we believe the truth of the word?
Yes.
Do we curse the man who denies the word?
Yes.
Do we call down hellfire on the man who has sinned against the word?
Yes.
His soul for all eternity writhe in anguish and damnation.
Don't pray to destroy birth!
Lord, we ask the same curse for those who ask grace for this sinner, though they be blood of my blood and flesh of my flesh.
Remember the wisdom of Solomon in the book of Proverbs. He that troubleth his own house shall inherit the wind.
Trouble sometimes are here, filling men's hearts with fear. Freedom we all hold dear, now is at stake. Open your heart to God, saves from the chastening rod. Seek the way pilgrims trod, Christians away. Jesus is coming soon, morning or night or noon.
Hello, friends, and welcome to the show. I'm Rachel Darnall, and you are listening to These Troubled Times, a Christian podcast on Christian fundamentalism. Before we get into today's episode, you may be wondering, why should you listen to me? There are a lot of voices out there on the internet, and there are actually a lot of voices talking about Christian fundamentalism. Because of the fact that the internet is a big place and it's kind of the Wild West, it's very important to me to establish trust with my audience. And that's why I will have a version of every episode of These Troubled Times posted up on my Substack, which I will drop a link to down below. And on that Substack post, you will not only be able to watch the video just like you can on YouTube, you'll also be able to read a running transcript, and that transcript will be footnoted, so you will see my citations and see where I'm getting all this from, because I don't make stuff up. I definitely rely on the work of other people, and mostly I am synthesizing what I'm reading and presenting it for you in a way that I hope is organized and interesting. My academic background is in theology. I recently graduated with a master's in theological studies. History is kind of a personal interest for me, so that's why you will always see me relying on other people's work for the history of this podcast. But I also have a personal background with Christian fundamentalism. I always say in my kind of boilerplate social media bio that I am a quiverful baby and a defector from the culture wars. So just by way of introduction, let me unpack what those terms mean. My parents had 10 children, of which I am the sixth. We were all homeschooled, most of us K through 12. Anything that came down the fundamentalist pike during the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and even into the early 2000s, my family was probably doing it. Most of that was because of my parents' contact with IBLP, the Institute for Basic Life Principles, and its founder, Bill Gothard. Bill Gothard was one of the early proponents of the quiverful movement. Psalm 127 compares children to arrows in the hand of a warrior, and it says that the man whose quiver is full of them is blessed. So the direction that the quiverful movement took this was that Christian parents were not supposed to use birth control. They were not supposed to do any form of family planning, not even natural family planning, and were instead supposed to just allow God to give them as many children as would come. And where this connects with the culture war is that the people who promoted quiverful were already seeing the world in this kind of culture war framework, where they saw secularism as being an enemy to be fought. So they interpreted the military context of that analogy to be very literal, and having a full quiver of children would be a great asset in the culture wars. And the culture wars refers to the idea that Christians should be fighting for cultural influence and really cultural dominance. And there are many different avenues that people who are fighting the culture war will take to achieve that. They might try to change laws. They might try to influence the way that children are being educated, especially in the homeschool and the private Christian school movements. They might also try to achieve this through the entertainment industry. You're seeing a lot of Christian studios pop up these days. Angel Studios is an example that is very successfully getting its message into the cultural mainstream. People who know where I'm coming from with all this might wonder if I have gotten into this because I have some kind of an axe to grind. So first of all, I'll say that I have been what some people might call deconstructing for about 13 years. So I am not new to this. I have had some time to work through my own personal emotions and issues with some of this stuff and kind of got into the other side of it. I'm not going to pretend like I don't have any issues anymore, but there's definitely a difference in where I am emotionally with this stuff today than where I was maybe 9 or 10 years ago. I can honestly say that I have walked away from or defected from the culture wars precisely because I did not want to grind the axe that I was given to grind literally in the womb. And that resistance to the culture war actually comes out of my Christian faith. Romans 12:8 says that as much as it depends on us, we Christians are supposed to be striving to live peaceably with all people. That means Christians, it means non-Christians. And the form of faith that I inherited was not conducive to doing that. Christian fundamentalism has a really hard time getting along peaceably with people even inside the church, much less people outside of it. And the reason why is because Christian fundamentalism is in a codependent relationship with conflict. Fundamentalism can, and it often does, start with things that really do matter. There are things that the early fundamentalists were concerned about that I am very sympathetic to and actually agree with their concern. But when fundamentalism begins to take a life of its own, it needs conflict to survive. So staying in Christian fundamentalism means living out a Christian faith that is always going to be looking for that next fight. When the prophet Isaiah is describing a people who have left the paths of God, one of the ways that he describes them is that they have not known the ways of peace. And that is a phrase that I have just kept coming back to and back to throughout my adult Christian life. And this podcast is really about rediscovering those paths of Christian peace and trying to envision what it would look like to walk on them. And part of that for me is approaching fundamentalism itself with a sense of curiosity and compassion. So buckle up, get curious, and settle in for the ride. Probably your first question about this podcast is, how exactly am I defining fundamentalism? Because fundamentalism can be a really slippery word. I will need to use the term fundamentalism in two different ways that are related but not identical. So let's start with the definition of fundamentalism that most people are probably thinking of when they use the word today. Fundamentalism is the militant response of a religious group when it perceives itself to be threatened by modernity. And fundamentalism is not just a Protestant Christian phenomenon. You can see fundamentalism in pretty much any major religion, from Islam to Judaism to Mormonism to even Buddhism. So why would religion perceive itself to be threatened by modernity? Modernity, in this definition, refers to scientific inquiry, but it also refers to increased contact with foreign cultures. So as much as Protestant fundamentalism has been a response to certain scientific theories, like Darwin's theory of evolution, it is just as much a response to living in a context of religious pluralism. And that is something that's not really anybody's fault. We live in a globalized world that's not going to go away, and we all have to figure out what we're going to do with that. When I say that fundamentalism is a militant response to modernity, I am not necessarily referring to literal violence, although fundamentalism can take the form of literal violence. Fundamentalist militance is really more about any kind of attempt to achieve cultural dominance over people who are outside of the faith. With this definition in mind, we can see a few things that fundamentalism is not. Fundamentalism is not a particular set of religious doctrines. It's not about what you believe, it's about how you hold your beliefs in the face of alternative points of view. So on this podcast, I'm not going to be about naming this person as a fundamentalist, that person as a fundamentalist. It's really about naming a phenomenon that I think is very human and very relatable. I do think that whether you are religious or not, it's a very normal thing that when you come face to face with somebody who doesn't share your beliefs, it's hard to know what to do with that. The other way that I will need to use the term fundamentalist in this season especially is to refer to a group of Protestant Christians at the beginning of the 20th century who self-identified as fundamentalists. This original version of fundamentalism is where we actually get our word fundamentalism. But as we will find, a lot of the people who were self-identifying fundamentalists at the turn of the century were people that we might not call fundamentalists today if we're going by that first definition. This original version of fundamentalism crystallized between 1910 and 1915 with the publication of a 4-volume set of theological essays called The Fundamentals, A Testimony to the Truth, which became a rallying point for theological conservative Protestants in America. Now, if you were to believe the mid-century scholarly consensus, that movement ended in 1925. So what happened in 1925? The Scopes monkey trial. The Scopes monkey trial was a lawsuit brought by the state of Tennessee against a high school teacher named John Scopes, who was caught teaching Darwin's theory of evolution to his class. At the time, Tennessee had a law against this, and the Scopes monkey trial was really kind of a test case, which is why it drew a lot of media attention from all over the country. On paper, the Scopes monkey trial was a big triumph for the fundamentalists. They did win the legal case, but actually, the Scopes monkey trial turned out to be the beginning of the end. The fundamentalists had won the legal battle, but they lost the public opinion war. The clip that we opened with is from the 1960 movie Inherit the Wind, which was based on a play that was written in 1955. Inherit the Wind was technically fictional, but it was transparently based on the Scopes monkey trial, which by 1955 had become almost a shorthand for anti-intellectualism and religious paranoia. This was so well established that fundamentalism was not actually ultimately Inherit the Wind's target. The Scopes monkey trial was supposed to be understood as a parable about McCarthyism, which was the much more relevant issue in 1955. But whatever its goals, Inherit the Wind helped to shape that picture of fundamentalism that you and I are probably familiar with today. That picture is not pulled out of thin air, but it's also not the whole story. Fundamentalism could look like that, and it increasingly did look like that as it was kind of driven underground in the wake of the Scopes monkey trial in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. But in the beginning, the fundamentalists were not an angry mob of Bible thumpers. They were a pretty respectable group of pastors, seminary professors, and educated lay people. And in this season, we're going to try to understand how they went from the fundamentals to the Scopes monkey trial and the direction that fundamentalism took after that. Because of the very nature of fundamentalism, you can't really understand what a fundamentalist is all about until you understand what he or she is fighting. And that's why we need to talk about something called theological modernism. Theological modernism was a movement within Protestant Christianity at the beginning of the 20th century. And what theological modernism was trying to do was to update Christianity for the modern world. The theological modernists believed that religion was not a static thing. It was supposed to evolve and change, and that was just part of a natural growth process that should not be impeded. Shaler Matthews, one of the most famous theological modernists during this time period, described his idea of modernism in his 1924 book, The Faith of Modernism. Religions spring from human needs. Each has grown as its teachings and institutions have satisfied creative souls. Each has become an enemy of progress when it has fastened upon society the authority of the past. So the theological modernists emphasized Christianity's moral and therapeutic dimensions over and against its doctrinal distinctives. They either discarded or reinterpreted aspects of Christianity that they considered to be kind of its rough edges. So at the turn of the 20th century, what were considered to be Christianity's rough edges? Modernists were very concerned about anything about Christianity that seemed unscientific or anti-progress. They questioned anything that was miraculous or supernatural about the Christian story, so things like the virgin birth or the atoning power of Jesus' death, and even Jesus' resurrection from the dead. Basically anything about Christianity that a modern, scientifically minded person would have trouble believing came up for review by the theological modernists. Now, this does not mean that every single theological modernist discarded every single doctrine that I just named. There was a lot of diversity within the modernists, just like there was a lot of diversity among the fundamentalists. But within theological modernism, there was definitely a consistent pattern of being open to adjusting traditional Christian doctrines. It's important that we understand the motivations of the theological modernists because they, just like the fundamentalists, felt like they were saving Christianity. The modernists believed that Christianity had something truly valuable to offer the world, and they did not want to see that disappear. In fact, they wanted to see Christianity have more influence in the public square. Like most Christians, the theological modernists connected secularism with moral decline, and that was something that concerned them very deeply. And they thought if the fundamentalists got their way, then Christianity would become so irrelevant to modern life that it would just be left by the wayside and the world would be the worse for it. So let's set the scene a little bit for the world that the modernists lived in and why they felt that public morals were just kind of in free fall.
It is now 11 o'clock. Go on with the dance.
The Industrial Revolution had led to a complete transformation of the marketplace, and the economy had become kind of a free-for-all where people who had capital were able to move the gears and levers of the economy just by virtue of being able to buy things up be able to borrow money at much greater rates than other people were able to do. So there were many monopolies developing or had already developed. And there was definitely a lack of concern about how these changes were affecting people at the human level. Many factories were using child labor because child labor was much cheaper and there was no minimum working age. And to make matters worse, the turn of the century workplace was not a safe place. It was not safe for adults, let alone for children. The manufacturing equipment and the labor processes were designed around efficiency, not safety, and workplace accidents and even death were very common. There were no laws regulating wages or saying how many hours an employee could be forced to work, and workers could be fired for trying to organize for better conditions. So the modernists were definitely very concerned about the way that wealthy people were taking advantage of working class people, but they also had plenty of criticism for the lower classes. Urbanization, which was a byproduct of the Industrial Revolution, had changed the landscape quite a bit, and one of the things it had done was to make private vices much more public. So sexual promiscuity became less discreet. And people had pretty good reason for paying attention to this stuff because medical research was showing how private sexual behaviors could lead to venereal diseases, aka STDs. So something that was before considered to be a private vice had now become a public health crisis. Another major problem that concerned people at the turn of the century was alcoholism. Now, if you have had a chance to look at any of the propaganda cartoons from this era that were pushing prohibition, you'll know that this could get pretty dramatic and pretty unhinged in the way that it was talked about. But they were not totally wrong. This was a real issue that was affecting people's lives. Thanks to new technologies in beer brewing, alcohol had become much more accessible to the poor and working classes, and especially to poor and working class men. Saloons were popping up everywhere in these urban environments, and these saloons were not a nice bar where you could go to have a quiet drink. These were rowdy, male-only spaces, and they were deliberately male-only because this was seen as a place where men could escape from the overly domestic environment that was associated with women and children. This was a period of time when virtue was associated with the female sex, and the female sex was associated with the domestic sphere. So the saloons became not only a place to drink, but also a place to gamble, a place to maybe solicit prostitutes, and just generally get away with bad behavior that would be frowned upon in a more genteel environment. Alcoholism was associated with all kinds of social problems, including joblessness, poverty, debt, family neglect, and domestic violence. So the modernist response to the world around them was to offer something that they called the social gospel. The social gospel, which was more or less aligned with the broader movement of progressivism, was about the power of Christianity to transform society, not just to convert individuals. The idea was that Christianity should be doing good in the world in the here and now, not just trying to get people their get out of hell free card. Modernists threw their energy behind all kinds of social causes, everything from prohibition to socialism.
Right within the Father's mercy, from his life.
The modernists were definitely not the only ones who were noticing these changes in society. The fundamentalists shared their concerns about the moral state of the country, but they interpreted the times in radically different ways. And that has to do with the differences between the modernist and the fundamentalist eschatology. So eschatology is a big $4 word that just means how you think that the story of the world or of humanity is going to end or resolve. So let's talk a little bit about fundamentalist eschatology. Not all fundamentalists had the same eschatology, but at the time that the fundamentals were published, the vast majority of people who identified as fundamentalists would also have identified as something called a premillennial dispensationalist. We will do a much deeper dive on dispensationalism and premillennialism in a later episode because it's extremely important to the development of fundamentalism during this era. But for now, all you need to know is that a premillennial dispensationalists would expect the world to get worse and worse and then end. So the goal of your typical Protestant fundamentalist was not to transform society. It was to achieve as many individual conversions as possible. Now, many fundamentalists did engage in faith-based mercy work, especially if it supported missions and evangelism, but they definitely had their priorities, and their biggest priority was soul winning. You may have heard that famous line that is attributed to Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., that some people are so heavenly minded that they're of no earthly good. And that's pretty much the way the modernists saw the fundamentalists. They asked, how are you going to do any good in the world? How are you even going to have a Christian witness if you don't expect that the world can get any better, if you're expecting it to get worse and worse and you think it's supposed to get worse? They thought of the fundamentalists as having a very morally bankrupt theology because they did not seem to be invested in the state of the world and the state of the people around them. The fundamentalists, on the other hand, criticized the modernists for being so focused on social transformation that they steamrolled over anything that they didn't think served an immediate practical purpose, even if the thing they were running over was Christianity's core saving doctrines. So the fundamentalists would ask of the modernists, what is the point of Christianizing society if Christianity is no longer Christian itself?
I want your opinion, your honest opinion. Now, don't let me influence you. I just want your opinion.
Fundamentalists were supposed to be the ones who didn't change with the times, but the fundamentalism of the early 1900s looks very different than the people that we might call fundamentalists today, and the people who would self-consciously see themselves as being the heirs of the fundamentalist movement. And the most striking difference is in the realm of eschatology, which we talked about a little bit earlier as being your theology of last things. Like I said, most Protestant fundamentalists were premillennialist dispensationalists, and that continued to be the case until well into the 70s. Even as recently as the early 2000s, the Left Behind books, which are set in an apocalyptic future based on a premillennialist reading of the book of Revelation, were considered by many people to be kind of the gold standard of Christian eschatology. But today, American fundamentalism is showing up most noticeably in Christian nationalism, which is something that we're watching play out in the political sphere right now. Like I said, the majority of Protestant fundamentalists in this first iteration of fundamentalism expected the end of the world imminently, and that's why they were in such a rush to convert people, try to go to the ends of the earth and convert people from foreign lands, and that was just their whole MO. There is a very different mood in Christian nationalism. I'm sure many of you will have noticed that there is not a lot of concern about anything that's happening outside of our own borders. It's all about putting walls up and protecting what we have, protecting our identity from outside forces, rather than going out and trying to bring the gospel to everyone. And this is where things get really interesting, because Christian nationalism, as the name implies, is extremely invested in transforming earthly systems. And they aren't, as I said, all that invested in missions and evangelism. And this is a direct result of their eschatology. Now, Christian nationalism has a lot of different streams of thought that's contributing to it, but one of those streams of thought is something called Christian Reconstructionism. Christian Reconstructionism began to be developed by R.J. Rushdoony in the 1960s, and it was picked up by Gary North and other figures in the 70s and 80s. Christian Reconstructionism is also called dominion theology. The kingdom of heaven is something that will come in gradually as Christians transform the world by taking spiritual dominion. And unlike their fundamentalist ancestors, they aren't really in a hurry. In fact, they tend to favor long-term strategies over short-term gains. Christian dominionism looks especially to Christian families to Christianize the world through something called multi-generational faithfulness. And this is where it dovetails with the quiverful movement that I was part of that I talked about earlier. Although it doesn't always look like it, and we'll discuss why that is more in season 2, dominionism is ultimately optimistic about social transformation. They expect it to happen. There may be very significant barriers, there may be very difficult times to go through before it happens, but they believe that it is an inevitability. So in a very technical sense of the term, they are social progressives. In this book, Christopher H. Evans makes the argument that the Christian right, which is where Christian nationalism lives today, as we all know, is actually as much an heir to the modernist social gospel as it is to classic fundamentalism. A variety of liberal political and religious groups castigated the Christian right for what they saw as the movement's exclusionary and homogenous vision of America. However, many progressives failed to notice how this conservative resurgence resembled aspects of the classical social gospel movement of the early 20th century. numerous evangelicals picked up on the older social gospel quest to Christianize America, even as most of them rejected the progressive political and theological visions espoused by social gospel leaders. And this should lead all of us, no matter which side of the culture wars we thought we were on, to ask the question, who exactly is us, and who exactly is them?
Sometimes are here, feeling means hard.